Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. This is a continuation in our Intro to Critical Theory lecture series, and we are dealing with Giorgio Agamben's State of Exception. This will be chapters 2 and 3 of the text. As I said in the previous lecture, chapter 2 is making direct reference to the Force of Law essay by Jacques Derrida, which I covered in 7 contextualized readings earlier in our series here. So this is definitely some complex stuff. And of course, the difference here is that Giorgio Agamben is titling the chapter Force of No Law or anomy, right? The law, the way he has it printed is that the word law is X'd out. He's returning to Carl Schmitt, and what he opens with is a distinction between 2 different books by Carl Schmitt. First is The Dictator from 1921, and the second is Political Theology from 1922. Now, political theology is by far the more famous text. It's also a lot shorter than The Dictator. And it's in, because Walter Benjamin keeps coming up, I just want to mention this. It's in Benjamin's letter to Schmidt, where he famously writes, and he says that Schmidt's conception of political theology or the exception, I can't remember exactly what, basically what Benjamin is saying is that Schmidt's discussion of the exception and the dictator totally makes him uh, not rethink so much, but it catalyzes his final thinkings about aesthetics. And so he writes with great admiration to Carl Schmitt, and this starts this dialogue that continues back and forth between Walter Benjamin and Carl Schmitt. Well after, 20 years after Benjamin's death, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, uh, Schmitt returns to the discussion with Benjamin in his book from 1956, Hamlet or Hecuba. And it just shows us something, right? I mean, when we think about like why did these scholars in the journal Telos in the late 1980s start turning back to Schmitt? Well, it's because they had been dealing with the classic Frankfurt School critical theorists, and through Benjamin, they come and Benjamin's interactions with Schmitt, they come to Schmitt himself. And that starts this whole engagement with the theory of the exception, and it causes this polarity in the critical theory community because I think a lot of people were so committed to the left from the beginning of the journal, right? When Paul Piccone like starts the journal, it's supposed to be the theory journal that uh, accompanies what was the new left. I mean, the new left is kind of gone its way kind of by 68. I guess you could say, I don't know, maybe you could argue with me with that, but it doesn't seem like the Democrats or in general, and then of course the more extreme, the new left, uh by the time Nixon comes into office, right? But and the tumult, which is a key word for today, in 1968 at the Democratic Convention, and all sorts of stuff I thought about a lot about when I was writing my own book. Uh, it signals kind of maybe the end of the new left and the introduction in the early 70s anyway of this not only revanchist right-wing kind of disposition, but the emergence first in Chile through the Chicago school folks, and then later with Reagan, the embracing of what will become neoliberalism itself. Now, this is so far outside of what Agamben's book is about, but I was already mentioning it in my previous lecture, and I think that I'm like part of my goal here is, this is an intro to critical theory class, and I'm trying to give you the uh, texts, the main texts for a way into trying to understand what is at stake in this discourse today. And I know it's very, very complex. And I've included all sorts of figures, of course, that it's like, yeah, I'm not doing a straight up like, let's just read the Frankfurt School theory, guys. You can do that sort of stuff and they're worth reading. But if we're going to be talking about critical theory, um, as an introduction to something that's ongoing, then we have to kind of come up as close as we can to the moment, right? Right. As I'm always telling my students on university campuses, like, you wouldn't go to a biology class and only be reading about the major figures in sort of 19th century biology or early 20th century biology, right? Or if you're doing genetics, like, we have to try to come up to a current discourse, but of course, so much of what discourse is built on previous other things, right? So, uh, what is at stake, I think, is hopefully coming across in these lecture videos is that like what we're building toward in this class is a way of thinking about uh, the potential danger of the rise of far right politics globally and the through line of the concern that critical theorists from the 1920s on have had of the takeover of a liberal democracy by some sort of totalitarian force. Now, this becomes much more extreme after Horkheimer and Marcuse and Adorno are forced out of Germany in the 1930s, right? In the 20s, it's more of a concern that liberal democracy is not going to be a stabilizing enough force, or a democratic enough force if we're going to take a left like pushing towards communist sort of critique of liberal democracy, which will go back to Marx and Marx's critique of bourgeois culture and bourgeois individualism and all of that sort of stuff. That's definitely in there, but the political concerns from between the wars, as you know, I mean, we really are thinking about maybe World War I and World War II as being connected to a lot of the same problems, right? And Schmidt himself is writing after, the concept might be total war, right? Total war is when you're not fighting just on the battlefield, but there are citizen casualties. It's happening in cities. There's the theater of war is literally everywhere. And these thinkers, whether they're on the right or the left, in that kind of 1920s moment, are definitely trying to come to terms with what has just happened. And I feel like the reverberations of that, in some ways, if we really want to kind of take being a historical perspective seriously, are still playing out today, right? Like, these lectures are not dealing with like the Israeli-Palestinian context at all, but we could look at the partitioning moments of the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East from 1918 on, or we could go back to that kind of partitioning of Africa in the early 19 or 1880s, excuse me, and look at that phenomena and look at like how geopolitics of the 20th century are changing. And I think that that is the broader sort of scope here for trying to deal not just with like potential crisis in democracy or a potential crisis in a constitutional crisis in the United States, which I do think that that is of concern right now, right? But I want my students of uh, critical theory, intro to critical theory, to not only understand things just in the context of the United States, but to understand the United States in its more globalized context. And this might sound like sophomoric, I guess, to people outside the United States, but my students at universities in the United States have been so cultivated to only think of things within domestic problems of the United States, and oftentimes with a kind of patriotic dogma, right? And nationalism that assumes that the United States is always the good actor in the world. And so there's a lot to be working through in terms of the various communities. And I'm assuming, of course, like this the web and I have a lot of watchers who are in Asia or in just different continents than North America for sure. But the direct audience that I'm thinking of here is definitely some of my students here, right, in the United States. So lots to be doing in an intro to critical theory course, to say the least. Let's turn back to Agamben here and uh, see this difference between the two books. I should say one more thing. Excuse me, but so in scholarship in the United States around Schmidt and the reintroduction of Schmidt from critical theory, you have this big kind of tension between mainstream liberals or liberal theorists, where the people who were extending the Frankfurt School line of critical theory. I would say that Jürgen Habermas and Sheila Ben Habib, who's still around, would be sort of in the trajectory of the second wave of the Frankfurt School. And we're not dealing with either of them so much in this particular course. Uh, Ben Habib, who was able to take a mini lecture with in 2011 at the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell, Ben Habib was like really, when Schmidt came up, it's like she bristled and like it's this kind of idea of like, why are we even talking about Schmidt? Like, why are we even talking about this Nazi? Like, by entertaining him, doesn't that give some sort of scholarly credibility, right, to Nazism? And so that is definitely a tension that has been going on within um scholars and what is the attention of scholarship and who deserves scholarship and all of that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of politics that are going on there. In Germany, just like if you're trying to, you can't be like doing a lot of work on Heidegger, for example, if you're a philosopher in Germany right now, because there are all sorts of concerns within their own system about to what extent Nazism is going to be entertained in a serious sort of way. Heidegger was unapologetic as a Nazi. Of course, Schmidt was unapologetic as a Nazi, and neither of them went through denazification processes. And so were not able to be taught and not so much that even, but they were not able to teach anymore in the German universities in the post-World War II moment. So that's maybe just a little bit more background stuff here. So there's something just by touching the subject, I feel like even though Italy is not Germany, obviously, Agamben in dealing with all of this kind of stuff is definitely has a finger on a nerve, and that nerve in Europe and European thought is different than the contours that it might take in the United States scholarship as well. Just something to be thinking about here. We want to try and have attention to both as much as we can, and to understand the contours, but our own geographies are going to limit our understanding, and of course that's why we talk to other people. Uh, so yeah, coming back I think it's a big deal. It's a bigger deal than what I was when I opened this, that the fact that people don't generally read The Dictator, but they read the political theology book and then they run with the theory from the political theology book. And the richness of Agamben here is that he's giving us not only the kind of close analysis between Dictator and uh State of Exception, or Political Theology, excuse me, the second book. But he is giving us a wider literature review on judicial theories of the exception and the different ways that they show up in different languages and cultures in this kind of philological method here. So, paragraph one, the most rigorous attempt to construct a theory of the state of exception was made by Carl Schmitt, essentially in the books Dictatorship and 1 year later in Political Theology. Because these two books from the beginning of the 1920s describe with a, so to speak, interested prophecy, he's going to become a Nazi and he has a political agenda, a paradigm that has not only remained current, but today has reached its full development. It is necessary at this point to present the fundamental theses of Schmitt's theory of the state of exception. Agamben is saying that there was a historical fallout, that we are still being not situated necessarily, but that still have reverberations today. This whole idea from the earlier chapters that the state of exception is becoming more and more the norm. And that is what is driving his analysis here. His analysis is not to praise a Nazi or something like that. Although I think a lot of far right and right-wing thinkers today have definitely gone back and pointed to Schmitt and become adherents of Schmitt in theoretical circles, just as they might follow Elaine to Benoist or something like that. Yeah, there are lots of right-wing thinkers. So he becomes a hero for people who are on the far right. And then for people who are not on that, then there's always this kind of dance or negotiation, like, why are we even dealing with this person? Schmitt in paragraph 2 here, Agamben says, so first, a few remarks concerning the terminology. In the book from 1922, The State of Exception is presented through the figure of the dictatorship. Dictatorship, however, which encompasses the state of siege, remember that went back to the French situation, right, to the French Revolution, and had its variations through Napoleon, through Napoleon III, through the Paris Commune, and etc., all the way up through the end of the Third Republic, when the Nazis invade, right? There's a whole genealogy there. So dictatorship, which encompasses the state of siege, is essentially a state of exception. And insofar as it presents itself as a suspension of law, it comes down to the problem of defining a concrete exception, a problem that up to now, he's quoting Schmitt here, has not been held in due consideration by the general theory of law. Having thus inscribed the state of exception within the context of dictatorship, Schmitt then distinguishes between commissarial dictatorship, which has the aim of defending or restoring the existing constitution, and sovereign dictatorship, in which, as a figure of the exception, dictatorship reaches its, so to speak, critical mass or melting point. The term dictatorship or the terms dictatorship and state of siege can thus disappear in political theology with the state of exception. The state of exception then takes their place, while this emphasis shifts, at least apparently, from the definition of exception to the definition of sovereignty. This is a really like salient point that Agamben is making here, that what is kind of going on in Schmitt's book. If we only take Schmitt and we don't consider the earlier ideas of the state of exception, even the state of siege or something like that, then we don't see what Schmitt is up to. The agenda that Schmitt has is to always direct us back to this question of sovereignty. And will say this to, although this is an intro class, I will say this to my colleagues out in the world today who are so, like uh, uh, enraptured with Carl Schmitt, but they aren't taking this kind of point into consideration when we're talking about sovereignty and sovereignty, like it's all over the place today, and you're only going back to someone like Schmitt. What Agamben is drawing our attention to is that it is Schmitt's agenda to make the state of exception always about ultimately a question of sovereignty itself. But that's not necessarily what is really going on juridically if we want to really analyze a theory of the state of exception. So he goes on and he says, in both books, the telos of the theory of the inscription of the state of exception within the juridical context, or sorry, the theory is the inscription of the state of exception within a juridical context. It's not, as he will say at the end of this paragraph, because a state of exception is always something different from anarchy and chaos. In a juridical sense, an order still exists in it, even if it is not a juridical order. A way to kind of think of that thought this culturally, although this is quite a shift, is the way that right wing and far right wing like politics show up in mixed martial arts today, in no holds barred type of ways of thinking about fighting and Fight Club, and the way that a movie like Fight Club, and the terminology like snowflake that comes from that, the way that the far right grabbed onto that and still continues to grab onto it. And I have members in my own family who are like, they grow up and they just think like, oh, I want to learn to like be a ninja, or I want to be like learn to defend myself or something, and embedded within the MMA world. It's almost like the MMA world is playing out state of exception over and over again if we were going to do a deep cultural analysis of that sort of thing. Obviously, that's like further along than what Schmidt is talking about here. But the point that Agamben is making with Schmidt is that it's not just like chaos. It's not a return to a so-called state of nature. It's, if we're really going to think about what the state of exception is, it has to exist within the juridical sort of order of things as a juridical concept, because the magic of the phenomenon, if you will, of the state of exception is that the state itself doesn't dissolve. Like to go back to Ernst Kantorowicz, an earlier thinker of this, like the idea of like the king is dead, long live the king. How does the order of things um, continue on? And in that sense, we were really want to think about state of exception versus revolution. And if you think about that, Schmidt is really thinking about what has happened in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution. He's situating state of exception as an alternative way than the Marxian notion of revolution. But at times in this discourse, it feels like you're splitting hairs around what is revolution, what is state of exception, what is the relationship of a state of exception to a revolution, all of that sort of stuff that does take us back. And he'll have a little allusion here to the dictatorship of the proletariat in Lenin here. Um, but think about Schmidt's historical context when he's thinking about this. It's not just the fact that Weimar Germany is an imposed liberal democracy from Western forces that might feel culturally offensive or invasive to Germans, who want to go back to someone like Otto von Bismarck or some sort of like Kaiser type of rule of law, or Kaiser Wilhelm or something like that, right? Uh, on the other hand, there is the situation to the east, which I feel like it's hard for those of us in the United States to really appreciate that, because we don't have the cultural memory of that Germans might have. So he says the specific contribution of Schmidt's theory is precisely to have made such an articulation between state of exception and juridical order possible. It is a paradoxical articulation, for what must be inscribed within the law is something that is essentially exterior to it. That is nothing less than the suspension of the juridical order itself, hence the aporetical formulation. In a juridical sense, an order still exists, even if it is not a juridical order. So then he goes on the next paragraph and he wants to, Agamben is saying, this is what commissarial dictatorship is. Commissarial dictatorship uh, suspends the Constitution um, in concreto in order to protect its concrete existence. Commissarial dictatorship ultimately has the function of creating a state of affairs in which the law can be realized. In commissarial dictatorship, the Constitution can be suspended in its application without thereby ceasing to remain in force, because the suspension signifies solely the concrete exception. The whole point of the exception is to keep the Constitution in force under commissarial dictatorship. Flip side of that is the sovereign dictatorship, right? So the situation is different with sovereign dictatorship, in which is not limited to suspending an existing constitution on the basis of a right that is provided for therein and is therefore itself constitutional. Rather, sovereign dictatorship aims at creating a state of affairs in which it becomes possible to impose a new constitution. In this sense, the operator allows the state of exception to be anchored to the juridical order and is the distinction between constituent power and constituted power. How close does that sound to Schmidt theorizing revolution, but theorizing a revolution in which a state stays a state? Again, that nostalgia that he has, the kind of, it's like it's a Catholic nostalgia for sure. I mean, I think there's a religious element to this, but there's also this nostalgia for an earlier kind of monarchical kind of sense of sovereignty. And in that sense, that would take us back to Jean Bodin and early thinkers on sovereignty, and why Schmidt wants to turn to the early modern, and why he writes a book in the 1930s on Thomas Hobbes, for example, or on Leviathan. So yeah, it's a question for us to think about. Is the sovereign dictatorship as a theory in Schmidt his answer to leftist Leninist revolution? Constituent power is not, however, a simple question of force. It is rather a power that, though it is not constituted in virtue of constitution, is nevertheless connected to every existing constitution in such a way that it appears as the founding power. And for this reason, it cannot be negated, even if the existing constitution might negate it. Though it is juridically formless, it represents a minimum of constitution inscribed within every politically decisive action and is therefore capable of ensuring the relation between the state of exception and the juridical order, even in the case of a sovereign dictatorship. So, unpacked or like simplified, even a sovereign dictatorship is not going to completely be a um, dissolution of the juridical order, even if the juridical order has been suspended itself within the state of exception. So here's where Lenin comes back in, right? So Agamben says, this clarifies why in the preface Schmidt can present the essential distinction between the commissarial dictatorship and sovereign dictatorship as, quote, the chief outcome of the book, which then makes the concept of dictatorship finally accessible to a jurisprudential consideration. Indeed, what Schmidt has had before his eyes was a confusion and a combination between two dictatorships that he never is never tired of denouncing. Yet, Neither the Leninist theory and practice of the dictatorship of the proletariat, nor the gradual exacerbation of the use of the state of exception in the Weimar Republic was a figure of the old commissarial dictatorship. They were rather something new and more extreme, which threatened to pull into question the very consistency of the juridico-political order and whose relation to the law is exactly what Schmidt sought to preserve at all costs. And I think that for although I don't identify as being on the right politically or anything, but I think that when right-wing thinkers who are um, uh, not the kind of caricature of the of a neo-Nazi or a neo-fascist or a far-right extremist or a Proud Boy or something like that. Like the thinking here is conservative for sure, and I think that Schmidt definitely has a point, right? And this is why, like we have to take Schmidt seriously and not just kind of write him off. It's like, well, politically, because he became Nazi and he has these kind of horrible moral qualities that extend from this type of thinking. He has even beneath this thinking of the two kinds of dictatorship, what he is saying, what Agamben sort of in a nicely nuanced way here, um, Agamben is saying that Schmidt sees in the post-World War One moment that something new and potentially devastating to everything has arisen. And we could call it total war. We could call it, there are different like things that I mentioned earlier. And Schmidt has a legitimate concern with the way that things are going. And of course, within that, like, and this is something I disagree with in Schmidt for sure, is that it's like the kind of nostalgia that he has for like we should go back to an earlier way of doing things because things are getting out of hand in this new and more extreme way that can't be theorized and within a juridical order. And so, what we must do, according to Schmidt, is we must find a way for the juridical order to contain a state of exception in order to stave off the chaos of revolution and anarchy, right? So, in political theology, then going on with Agamben here. In political theology, on the other hand, the operator of the inscription of the state of exception within the juridical order is the distinction between two fundamental elements of law, norm and decision. In the Dictator book, it's about commissarial dictatorship versus sovereign dictatorship. But by blending them two and finding a way to think them through a juridical order, Schmidt maneuvers over into a new way of conceiving that the real problem beneath both commissarial and sovereign dictatorship is the question of sovereignty itself, which is going to lead him in the book Political Theology to the opening famous lines and why they resonate so much that the sovereign is the one who makes the decision in the state of exception. And this is what Agamben is saying here, is that in the book Political Theology, the key tension is between the idea of the juridical norm and the decision itself. The top paragraph on page 35. At this point, we can understand why the theory of the state of exception can be presented in political theology as a theory of sovereignty. The sovereign who can decide in the state of exception guarantees its anchorage to the juridical order. But precisely because the decision here concerns the very annulment of the norm, that is, because the state of exception represents the inclusion and capture of a space that is neither outside nor inside, the space that corresponds to the annulled and suspended norm, quote, the sovereign stands outside of the normally valid juridical order and yet belongs to it, for it is he who is responsible for deciding whether the Constitution can be suspended in total. being outside and yet belonging. This is the topological structure of the state of exception, and not only and only because of the sovereign who decides on the exception is in truth logically defined in his being by the exception. Can he too be defined only in this way? Can he too be defined by the oxymoron ecstasy belonging with a hyphen in between there? The relationship between the dictatorship, the book, and political theology, the book, must be seen in light of this complex strategy of inscribing the state of exception within the law. I've already just said that earlier. Then Agamben says this is in his note to 2.1. There is no doubt that his theory of the Schmidt's theory of sovereignty represents an attempt to anchor the state of exception unequivocally in the juridical order. But the attempt would not have been possible if the state of exception had not first been articulated within the terms and concepts of dictatorship and, so to speak, juridicized through reference to the Roman magistracy and then through the distinction between the norms of law and the norms of realization. So this is going to take Agamben and his project back into a re-examination of Roman law as a way to counter or argue um, the shortfalls of Schmidt's analysis. In 2.2, Schmidt's theory of the state of exception, excuse me, proceeds by establishing within the body of law a series of caesurae or divisions whose ends do not quite meet, but which by their means of articulation and opposition allow the machine of law to keep functioning. Skipping a paragraph here on page 36 just for time, where he gets to this distinction between norm and decision. Take now the opposition between norm and decision. Schmidt shows that they are irreducible in the sense that the decision can never be derived from the content of a norm without a remainder. Next paragraph down. We can then define the state of exception in Schmidt's theory as the place where the opposition between the norm and its realization reaches its greatest intensity. And then he has this interesting shift over in the note here to linguistics and to grammar. And clearly, what I think Agamben has in mind here, but I'm not sure so much that Schmidt had in mind here. But Agamben is clearly referring here to Ferdinand de Saussure and his general theory of linguistics, which definitely is around. Like his theories had been delivered in lecture form, but when we read that book by Ferdinand de Saussure, it's really a collection of his lecture notes by his students. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's close in proximity, but I don't think that it's exactly the theory that's directly influencing someone like Schmidt. Nevertheless, I think that this is an interesting aesthetic move, and of course, Agamben is an aesthetics professor. In his note here, that he wants to think about the relationship between an analogy between language and law. He says the structural analogy between language and law is illuminating here, and as linguistic elements subsist in long without any real denotation, they acquire only an actual discourse. So, in the state of exception, the norm is in force without any reference to reality. I have some semiotics lectures on the site. It's in the structuralism course where I go very in depth into Ferdinand de Saussure and then into Roland Barthes and his book Semiology, where he reverses some of this idea. So it's too much to go into at the end of the or in the intro course here, but there's some stuff out there that I can point you toward. Uh, very, very briefly, what Saussure is saying is that language and the symbology of language is always, um, in a certain sense, arbitrary, right? A different language Um, in French, the word for dog is chien, but in English, dog kind of thing, right? So our sound signs are just have a kind of arbitrariness in relationship to the thing that they refer to, the sign versus the signified thing, and what is the sort of referent point when we're thinking about sound signs, or if we're writing them down, visual. It's not like visual language or something like that. And so in French, langue is the language itself under Saussure versus parole, which is speech. So none of us who are speaking the English language today have complete 100% command of every single word within the English language. Some of us might have very huge vocabularies. Shakespeare had a quite large vocabulary, but we don't work within a language, or I should say, we always work within a language, but we don't work from like an executive sort of power over the entire language itself because the language is a socio-political it's a kind of technology that humans of a certain society develop in order that they can adapt to the society, to put it in kind of Darwinian types of terms. Like I'm always telling students in linguistics lectures, like language is technology. Humans develop it. Like it's not technology like the computer or the camera that I'm talking into right now. uh it's a tool for human adaptation, right? But they're different languages and they have different sound signs. And so uh to use the famous Heidegger line, language speaks us. We don't come into the world having a whole sense of language. We learn a language through our parents or the people who are around us. Maybe we're multilingual, of course. There's room for thinking of that sort of thing. But this is the shaping of the ways that we come into being through language in the world, and that whole lots of 20th and 21st century theory about that kind of stuff. It goes into Lacan and Levinas and Lakoff and Chomsky and all sorts of stuff that we're not talking about in the intro course here. But the point is, in Agamben's note, is that there's something similar to that distinction between long language, broadly speaking, and the inaction of language as we maneuver into speaking and trying to communicate with one another that is operating analogously within a legal system when a law is put into force or when it just sort of hovers and it is the capital L law. You might think about Kafka's famous story of before the law, the allegory or the allegory of being before the law. And yeah, Kafka, thinking Kafka alongside Schmidt is a useful, I think, endeavor. Different course, dealing with more with the literary elements here. So we maneuver from this note where Schmidt says, in this sense, the floating signifier, which he attributes to Claude Lévi-Strauss. In this sense, the floating signifier, this guiding concept of in the human sciences of the 20th century, corresponds to the state of exception, in which the norm is in force without being applied. This is a really interesting idea. And again, if like I would appoint you to the structuralism lectures there, uh, although as I'm thinking about it, the Bakhtin stuff never got finished in that lecture series. Uh, what you can look up on Google or something, what is a floating signifier, and there are different terms that we could use for this. It has to do with how static meaning might be in a symbol. Like if you see in the United States, if you see like a sign on the corner that's a red and it's an octagon in shape, it says stop on it and it means stop. But we could see that same sign in a different country and not understand the word the word in the particular language, but we know that it means to stop, right? So there's a sort of consistency to that kind of symbology. But when we're thinking about like what we might call in literature complex metaphors or sometimes public metaphors, like what is freedom? Or what does Moby Dick, the whale, represent in the novel Moby Dick? It's going to mean a lot of different things to different people and different interpretations. And that is what the floating signifier is going to be. My indigenous colleague, Ting Tinker, always critiques this kind of tendency towards abstraction within Euro-Christian culture, and wants to distinguish that indigenous worldview does not have that kind of thing. And so when, even though Claude Lévi-Strauss is very smart, is dealing with those types of linguistic ideas and thinking about indigenous cultures in the world, it can really um, it can get heated with my indigenous colleagues because they feel like what he's doing is he's bringing his Euro-Christian kind of mind into indigenous cultures, but he's saying very interesting things. And we'll come back to that with some terminology later on here. So we get to section 2.3 in uh, Schmidt here, and or sorry, in Agamben. And this is where Agamben, signals to us that he's thinking of Derrida's Force of Law essay, which we already covered. In 1989, at the Cardozo School of Law in New York, Jacques Derrida gave a lecture titled Force de loi, Le fondement mystique de l'autorité. The lecture, which in truth was a reading of Benjamin's essay Critique of Violence, gave rise to a wide debate among philosophers as well as jurists. But the fact that no one attempted to analyze the seemingly enigmatic formula that gave the text its title is an indication not only of the complete separation between the political and legal cultures, but also of the latter's decline. That the legal cultures, and especially I think he's thinking of the United States, has detached itself from the philosophical culture. I would say that a different way of articulating this is the kind of overblown mischaracterized notion of what is at stake in critical race theory. Because critical race theory is precisely as it arises in the 1980s and 1990s with Derek Bell and his students at Harvard, is precisely the thinking of culture and history and the way that in culture and that history that certain people who have had access to power by however the human grouping might want to work in terms of race, in terms of religion, in terms of gender, or something like that, have sustained and carried on a particular privileges within that culture. That would be more of the philosophical side of things, versus a kind of uh, what Agamben I think is calling here an impoverished sense of a juridical order, that doesn't think that sort of thing anymore. The separation between the humanities and the sciences is another way of putting it, and especially in U.S. universities. Overemphasis on STEM, 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 and more than 50 years of emphasis on STEM so that the United States can keep its place on top of the world, but without the kind of balancing, or like the idea that we would even have to have a division between the humanities and STEM. That's a problem of the 20th century. And the impoverishment that we have in our civic culture today, is partly in the United States, and partly the whole project of why I'm doing this Center for Critical and Cultural Theory, is because I think that it's necessary to counteract like half a century of treating humanities like they don't matter unless they're at some sort of Ivy League type of school where there's just tons and tons of funding, right? And so it is that vacuum that creates the possibility for a right-wing overhaul of the entire legal system that's been going on since the 1970s and that has infiltrated all the way up to the Supreme Court of people who are not necessarily thinking in terms of the complexity of the human condition, in the complexity of ethics and philosophy, what they're doing is enacting an agenda. Um, uh, so Derrida's force of law essay, because I mean, then also he's a European, so he's coming in like dropping a bomb in this American context. That's part of the controversy of going on. And then it's like, oh, you like post-structuralists can't even understand what you're saying anymore. It's all just a bunch of mental gymnastics. It's and then on the uninformed kind of view, even on the left, it's like, oh yes, it's just all these white European men. Why when are we going to get rid of all the white European men? It's like, no, the whole thing about critical race theory is coming from a rich realm of thought. And yes, white European men have their own sort of particular dispositions in their genealogies and their histories, and it's something to be critiqued for sure. But what by the time we get to somebody like Derrida coming in, who's responding to the breakdown of the French situation in Algeria, and he's an Algerian, French, and Jewish person to begin with, and the way that thinkers like that are interacting with and thinking about what becomes something like critical race theory. If we separate all of that stuff out, then it's like, oh, well, the critical race theorists are just this American phenomenon or something like that. But no, from a discourse of theory, there's a lot more going on. And yes, I guess I get the fact that like if you're I don't know, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's out there, I admire you, Kimberly Crenshaw. Yeah, yeah, there's a point when you're a lawyer and you have to be doing just the lawyer work, but there's also the philosophical work that is going on there. So I don't know if Kimberly Crenshaw is BFFs with Jacques Derrida or anything like that. There might be some room for criticism between there. I also, if you are following podcasts and stuff, I find Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality podcast um, really good and really useful for me. And I know it's not directed necessarily for people with my embodiment, but we try to learn from different perspectives, right? And the fact that it's out there, I really appreciate her work. Uh, so Derrida's force of law essay causes this explosion in the 1980s. Also in the 1980s, there is the explosion in academic thought around like, why is there even this return to somebody like Schmidt? And the concern, the through line concern, as I keep saying, from a critical theories perspective, is the worry that liberal democratic society is going to be taken over by a totalitarian situation. Now, what else is happening worldwide in the late 1980s? Well, the Berlin Wall is falling. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union is going to collapse. And then everybody's going to be in this moment where they say that capitalism won, there's no such thing, there's no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher and Reagan might say, there's no alternative to capitalism. And there is like in that rupture of the binary thinking between East and West, between like the Cold War type of thinking, then there's this whole different sort of situation that emerges as the global war on terror 10 years later on, right? So the concern, the critical theory concern, is not simply that totalitarianism is going to take over liberal democracy. Like, so big, like I think that some people think at the time it's like, well, the critical theory that's done because liberal democracy and capitalism won. So why are we even talking about that kind of thing anymore? And what we have seen since the 1990s has been the fallout of that neoliberal type of disposition that has opened a door. Some of you might conceive of it as a back door, but made more and more it feels just like a front door. But there's a back door left open to a totalitarian or far right takeover of a liberal democracy, and that we are increasingly seeing that sort of situation in a liberal democracy like the United States today. But not only here, right? Like the rise of the far right happens globally, and it doesn't always happen only in liberal democracies. But the big concern for somebody living in one is is that we are not as secure or free or isolatable, to like think about the way that someone like Donald Trump and the return to a kind of nationalism, like a staunch kind of nationalism. Um, uh, it's one thing to say that sort of thing, but it's another thing to realize that we live economically in a global order, right? So the retreat to nationalisms around the world as an answer to global pandemics, to economic crises, also there's a lot more going on than just like kind of right-wing, left-wing politics in the United States or Democrats versus Republicans. And at the same time, there is um, a growing concern, the horrors of the 20th century um, have a way of returning or potentially returning questions of genocide coming up. That's an ongoing, and we have to have a whole course on genocide law because it has never been fully realized. But the more it's been realized, the more that we see it happening in the world. But then people want to say that it's not really happening in the world because it's not the same thing as what was happening in Germany during the Holocaust or the Shoah or something. So there's a whole sort of discourse going on there. But I think the people who are pointing out genocides around the world are have in mind this like this is what happens when you put people in cages on borders. This is what happens when you have a military offensive against a particular political entity, but you're mostly targeting women and children to prevent the reproduction of a community of people, to diminish that population, to make it them to eventually dissolve them, right? The strategies over time of something like genocide. Um, Increasingly in Derrida's late work, he's dealing with that kind of stuff. He's dealing with ideas of the human and what makes us human. He's engaging with Levinas very heavily at the end of his life. His one of his last books is The Animal, Therefore That I Am, which is a really, really interesting book. And there is within critical theory kind of world or discourse, there are people who say, and I would say Gabriel Rockhill, who I've mentioned this several times, and I admire Rockhill's work a lot. He is definitely of the persuasion that like this whole sort of transition towards post-structuralism is like a diversion tactic from true Marxian kinds of revolution. It's a way that people like Horkheimer and Adorno come to the United States, that Arendt comes to the United States, and they become enamored with U.S. culture. They became defenders of U.S. culture. Arendt's On Revolution is one of those the key points there. In Samuel Moyn's recent book, he says that the Cold War liberals actually give too much power to the values of Christian civilization that then paves the way for the opening of the Christian right, or now what we call people call um, white Christian nationalism in its more extreme form in the 21st century. Um, and I am positioning myself like so I'm aware of these writers and I really appreciate their perspective. So this is like not a oh, F you, like Gabriel Rockhill or F you, Samuel Moyn. But I think that they're really great thinkers and they're helping me think. And also, I'm not necessarily um, uh, 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 just dogmatically trying to defend somebody like Jacques Derrida here, but I am trying to say like, well, is this really what happened? Or is there more to what's being demonized as like, well, did postmodern philosophers are they the creators of Trumpism in the sense that like everything has become relative or something like that? I think that what Derrida is saying in the Force of Law essay, and that the reason why it's so enmeshed in this whole kind of discursive world in the way that I've characterized it with critical race theory and all of that is that his conception of deconstruction and justice is asking for a reevaluation of all of European, or in my language, Euro-Christian society itself, right? And that definitely is a through line in critical theory thought. And you can see how that would align with post not simply postmodern, but post-colonial thought as well. And that's a trajectory that we've covered. And I've also said that indigenous theory, which is contemporary and which is not post-colonial theory, is a different way of thinking about this stuff because the post-colonial trajectory was always in a kind of trajectory aligned with the Euro-Christian colonization efforts and a freedom from that particular oppression. But the current indigenous theory today is saying not only that the oppression never ended, colonialism never ended, the whole discourse, the idea that it ended is actually a move to rhetorically erase as still existing indigenous peoples today. And that's not so much part of Jacques Derrida's project. I would say, is like a way of coming into the 21st century and what's at stake for somebody like me as a thinker in this field, if we even want to call it a field, but this discourse of critical theory. Okay, so let's come back to the force of law because, um, uh, like at the end of force of law in our lectures, we saw that not only has Derrida interrogated the way that justice and force um, can be deconstructed in his sense, and that deconstruction is itself a kind of justice, but it's not a positive law kind of justice, right? That's not what he's saying. Um, Agamben is extending that in this essay, and that's why he has this sort of crossed out law. Like law is there, but it has the crossed out signature, so it keeps the trace, to use Derrida's terminology. And there is the question of the signature itself, if you remember back there, like what contains itself in the signature is the signature, a way of rethinking or updating what Schmidt is trying to keep into a kind of consistency between the state of exception and not. That I think that is definitely a question that we could ask and worth a worthy essay project if somebody were willing to dig into it. As we go back to Agamben here, he says, behind the syntagma of force of law stands a long tradition in Roman and medieval law, where uh, it has the generic sense of of efficacy, the capacity to bind, religio, like where we get religion, right, to bind, or religare. Um, but only in the modern epoch, in the context of the French Revolution, does it begin to indicate the supreme value of those state acts declared by the representative assemblies of the people. Thus, in Article 6 of the Constitution of 1791, force of law designates the untouchability of the law, which even the sovereign himself can neither abrogate nor modify. In this regard, modern doctrine distinguishes between the efficacy of the law, which rests absolutely with every valid legislative act and consists in the production of legislative effects, and the force of law, which is instead a relative concept that expresses the position of the law or acts comparable to it with respect to other acts of the juridical order that are endowed with a force superior to the law, as in the case of the Constitution, or inferior to it, such as the decrees and regulations issued by the executive. The decisive point, however, is that in both modern and ancient doctrine, the syntagma force of law refers to it in the technical sense, not to the law, but to those decrees, which, as we indeed say, have the force of law. The executive power can be authorized to issue in some situations, particularly the state of exception. So what you see in theory, broader theory discourse after Agamben and in relationship to Derrida here, and the attention on language that Agamben has brought in with his reference to Ferdinand de Saussure earlier, is the the notion of deictic or deictic act. So in rhetoric, what this means is like an act that does as one says the act, it performs the act itself, the performance of language. You can see this all over Judith Butler's work, and in affect theory of the 21st century, and Lauren Berlant, for example. But it's like breaking the bottle over the bow of a ship is a good example of deixis. Or when a king knights a person, and now I knight you, and I do this sort of thing, and it's the act itself. So, how does the performative act relate to some codified legal system? It's really a question of writing and memory, going all the way back to Plato, and Aristotle for sure, but especially in Plato, especially in Phaedrus, especially in the Gorgias. Socrates is very concerned about writing and being taken out of context. And of course, that is very much the situation that kind of leads to his execution. So there's a deep, deep meditation on Western civilization or Western philosophy going on here. Um, Skipping down, I'm on page 38 in chapter 2, still in section 2.3. In our discussion of the state of exception, we have encountered numerous examples of this confusion between the acts of executive power and the acts of legislative power. Indeed, as we have seen, such confusion defines one of the essential characteristics of the state of exception. The limit case is the Nazi regime in which, as Eichmann never tired of repeating, the words of the Führer have the force of law. I was just following orders. You have to follow the words of the Führer because they have the force of law. But from a technical standpoint, the specific contribution of the state of exception is less the confusion of powers, which has been all too strongly insisted upon, than it is the separation of the force of law from the law, says Agamben here. It defines a, quote, state of the law in which, on the one hand, the norm is in force, but is not applied. It has no force. And on the other hand, acts that do not have the value of law acquire its force. That is to say, in extreme situations, force of law floats, that floating signifier thing, right? Floats as an indeterminate element that can be claimed both by state authority, which acts as a commissarial dictatorship, and by a revolutionary organization, which acts as a sovereign dictatorship. The state of exception is an anomic, a lawless, right, space in which, or no, it is a no law space is a better way of saying it than lawless, I think. The state of exception is an anomic space in which what is at stake is a force of law without law, which should therefore be written force of law with law crossed out. Such a force of law in which potentiality and act are radically separated is certainly something like a mystical element, or rather a fictio, like a fiction, right? By means of which the law seeks to annex the anomy itself. But how is it possible to conceive of such a mystical element and the way that it acts in a state of exception? This is precisely the problem that we must clarify. And of course, this is all going back into Derrida's earlier essay about divine law and his interrogation of Benjamin, right? So we have want to try and keep that in mind here. But it's also, and I would say beyond what either Derrida or Agamben are saying here, is on the one hand that we're dealing with writing here as and I think Derrida would I don't know, high five me on that, because his of grammatology is exactly about the ways that inscription works. He's very concerned with that whole notion. But and so even if we're saying, oh, it's really law that is force of law that has this crossed out kind of signifier, it's a very visual way, and it's a writing a written way of thinking about how conception works itself. That I think that some of my indigenous colleagues might have some problems with that Derrida, as sophisticated as he is, he never sort of escapes the kind of Euro-Christian tradition, even though he's thinking about Greek and early Judaic kind of forms of writing and inscription, and of course the Bible, whether we're talking about the Bible and biblical law and Leviticus and all of that kind of stuff. Um, we are also thinking about something like culture, like what holds culture together itself. But culture is one of those floating signifier concepts as well, just as a nation is a kind of floating signifier kind of concept, which Hannah Arendt in her Origins of Totalitarianism is going to trace back, and the relationship of Jews in relationship to the new nation state as being both inside and outside is going to be part of of this larger story, or this larger way of thinking of what has happened historically in relationship to the rise of nation state politics following 1648, if we want to use that date, right? The excuse me, the Westphalian, not the Weimar, the Westphalian peace, the last Christian peace, which is a good book on that particular subject there. Are we seeing, in other words, the broader questions, are we seeing the breakdown of the nation state? Is that what we are living through? Is the breakdown of the nation state and the incomprehensibility of the way that legal systems have been formed in the Euro-Christian tradition, or the Euro-Western tradition, if you want. And what do we do outside of that? Now, the pop culture version of this is the return to the state of nature. It's Rick Grimes in, what is the zombie show? Walking Dead, right? Which like lasted for like a really long time. Now there's all these offshoots from it. It's Lost, the older show now, that you can stream on Netflix, with the people on the deserted island and the plane crash sort of thing. There, what we see in 21st century pop culture in the United States over and over again is not only some version of the apocalypse and the Civil War movie coming out, just last year, but we see over and over again the breakdown of everything and the return to a quote state of nature, and then who's going to be the decider, right? That's a pop culture version of what the state of exception is and all this sort of stuff. But the scholars are interrogating this in a deep way, according to the genealogies of law and governance itself. Um, in section 2.4. So like, I want to go into this right now. Eduardo Viveros de Castro, great anthropologist, writes that in the ways that we used to think about religion, like there's this religion and that religion, the Muslims and the Christians, or blah blah blah, that the people used to talk about it in terms of religion, and that the our modern notion of culture is a replacement for that kind of early modern way of thinking about things. And so when we throw religion back into the mix here, and the rise, or sometimes people want to call it a return of religion to the center place of public discourse, especially in the United States, and especially since the 1990s, and especially after like a situation of a state of emergency like 9/11 or something like that, right? It reopens up this whole question of like, it was the project of secularization that the Enlightenment philosophers wanted to introduce with their new state systems ever achieved? Was it a false kind of fiction? What is the presence like for people? And this is why Islam, I think, is such an important um, uh, interlocutor in this discourse. I don't know how to put it, like Islam as if it's one big thing, right? Like there's a lot of different Islams. Uh, but just like there's a lot of different Christianities, but the return of that in the post 9/11 moment into US discourse, it's doing this other kind of work. If we're looking in a broader perspective, there's the question of the history of so-called secular culture, and that Schmittian idea of that, like, all significant political concepts are secularized theological ones. So is there this kind of theological resonance, messianic resonance, divine justice resonance, mystical resonance that is going on in all of these different thinkers here? In section 2.4, second paragraph, he says, once again, this analogy of language is illuminating. In the addition, so now he's brought, this was a note earlier where I was talking about Saussure, but he's brought it into the main part of his text. So I think that's interesting. He says, once again, the analogy with language is illuminating. In the relation between the general and the particular, and all the more so in the case of the application of a juridical norm, it's not only a logical subsumption that is at issue, but first and foremost, the passage from a generic proposition endowed with a merely virtual reference to the concrete reference to a segment of reality. That is nothing less than the question of an actual relation between language and the world. This passage from long to parole is, or from semiotic to semantic, is not from the structure of language to meaning. That little division is going to be the division between the Chomskyists and the George Lakoff followers in the so-called linguistic wars of the later 20th century. That distinction is going to be the heart of all debates about AI in contemporary culture. I'm not going to go into that here, but what I'm saying is that this is what critical theory as a discipline does, or as a discourse, excuse me. I don't know that it's quite a cohesive discipline. As a field, as a discourse, this is what attention to theory does, is it gives us the ways to think about things like AI, but it's coming from these completely different seeming angles like law, legality, force of law, state of exception, all of that kind of stuff. So this passage from long to parole, from the semiotic, the structure of language, to the semantic, the meaning, is not a logical operation at all. Rather, it always entails a practical activity. That is the assumption of long by one or more speaking subjects and the implementation of that complex apparatus that Benaviste described as the enunciative function. Again, the enunciative, that deictic thing that I was just referring to early on, but that's so that later thinkers, especially I think some feminist thinkers are thinking about that because or gender theorists are thinking about what performance is and performativity and language. And if we're thinking about that trajectory of critical discourse into gender theory and things like that, then when we're talking about transgender issues, that if we fast forward to the 21st century, there is a complete richness going on in that discourse and in the fact that it's not just discourse, it is very much embodiment for trans people. And that sort of right-wing attempt to erase all of that kind of stuff that's going on, to say that this is all fictional, blah, 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 is a way to avoid at all costs what is really going on in terms of the complexity of what's at the basis of law itself. So, if we look at Judith Butler's recent book, which I was reading, I'm reading with some colleagues right now, um, the attention of like just like the exponential almost growth of legal sort of attempts to legislate against transgender people in the sort of overt kind of law is showing this kind of phantasm, to use Butler's recent term. It's a kind of it shows the anxiety that like at the core of law, at the core of um, what people are trying to hold on to as a certain kind of culture is something that was never that firm to begin with. Which is exactly, I think, what going back to what Derrida really means by deconstruction, or the idea of deconstruction. It's not a process. It's not like a tool I pull out of my belt and now I'm going to deconstruct this. And what he's saying is that it is part of the flow and the flux of the way that existence and reality is. It is kind of metaphysical, um, situational type of way that the world and the universe works, and the complexity of the critical theory that emerges in the 60s and 70s out of schools like Vincent VIII and Paris 8, right? Like where Foucault and um Deleuze and Guattari, they're all trying to come up with a way of thinking that not only is literary and psychoanalytic, it blends those two areas, but also blends current thinking in physics, like quantum physics and things like that together. So if the theory is very hard to read, it's because they believe that critical theorists there should be no division between humanities and math or sciences or STEM or something like that. It's that we have to keep up with our theorizing and our thinking about how politics and law and how all and literature and aesthetics work in relationship to the new findings that our scientists are telling us. But when we have a divorce and we only have an instrumentalized view of what science is, that obviously leads us back into the problems of like that created the postmodern moment to begin with, that like without check on instrumental reason, we come up with the weapons of mass destruction that can destroy not only all humans, but all life on the planet Earth, right? Uh, how did I get there from talking about transgender stuff? I think that like the kind of cathexis or like the disgusting way that transgender people are vilified in our current culture, and it happens at the level of law and these people in power, and it happens around your kitchen table. How people will just say things without knowing squat about the actual issue, right? The way that it just sort of like pops out in this unthinking kind of way. Um, that the non-locational of non-binary people or of queerness in general, the violence that's being visited on them is part of a larger cultural anxiety that scapegoats these people. It is scapegoating in the the most reducible sort of like way that the concept works, right? And in the most brutal and the most uncritical and the most idiotic ways of thinking. There's my sermon there. Sort of ending chapter 2 of Agamben here. I want to read the last paragraph. And then I guess I was hoping to get through chapter 3 too, maybe in this lecture. I don't know, we'll see. In this sense, the state of exception is the opening of the space in which application and norm reveal their separation from pure force of non-law, anomic law, crossed out law, realizes that is, applies by ceasing to apply a norm whose application has been suspended. In this way, the impossible task of welding norm and reality together, and thereby constituting the normal sphere, is carried out in the form of the exception. That is to say, by the presupposing of their nexus. This means that in order to apply a norm, it is ultimately necessary to suspend its application to produce an exception. In every case, the state of exception marks a threshold at which logic and praxis blur with each other, and a pure violence without logos claims to realize an enunciation without any real reference. I think that hovering behind that is definitely Derrida's idea of divine violence and in his interrogation of Benjamin there. I think also hovering behind this, and maybe he'll come back to it, but showed up in my previous Agamben reading here. Agamben wants to keep coming back to the idea of the political and the political as praxis. And in this sense, I think that he's thinking of Aristotle, and he's thinking about Aristotle's politics. Um, in a sense, I think that we could say that like Agamben is more Aristotelian and Derrida is more Platonic. Derrida is more interested in Plato. and the question about writing. And I think that Agamben is more interested in praxis and of course the aesthetic articulation of things. Let me push on to chapter 3 here. You can pause or whatever. This is going to lead Agamben back into this interrogation of uh, Roman law itself. And this is where he shines, right? This is where his expertise as an Italian himself, but also as a an aestheticist. He's going to center chapter 3 on this idea of Justidium, which, if we look it up as a translation of the Latin term, it means a temporary suspension of jurisdiction and juridical operations. A temporary suspension of jurisdiction and juridical operations. And he says earlier on, as I mentioned in this lecture, he does say that Schmidt has an idea of this concept, but Schmidt maneuvers around it into another kind of discourse because and it becomes that discourse of commissarial dictatorship versus sovereign dictatorship because the ultimate agenda for Schmidt is to locate the entire thing in the idea of norm and decision and in the ability of the sovereign to decide on norm and decision, or the sovereign being the one who decides in the state of exception. So he's going to maneuver in the chapter 3 here into a rereading of the Institutium of Roman law, which he says can in some way be considered as an archetype for the modern state of exception, and yet indeed perhaps precisely for this reason does not seem to have been given significant attention by the legal historians, both before Schmidt, in Schmidt, and after Schmidt. So he's trying to give us a corrective. He says in the third paragraph that Justidium means when the law stands still, just as the sun does in the solstice. So again, there's that kind of mystical context, and I love that there's this we could call it pagan context, but there's this earlier human context, like solstices mean something around the world to different peoples, even to indigenous peoples, and so I like that attention to the history that Agamben gives there. Over on page 43 in section 3.2, I'm maneuvering faster for time's sake here. He's dealing with the German concept of Notstand or for the exception here. He says, just as every citizen acquires a right of self-defense in those urgent situations in which the protection of the community fails, so there is also a right of self-defense for the state and for every citizen as such when the community is in danger and the magistratical function breaks down, though in a certain sense, it stands outside of the law. It is nevertheless necessary to make the essence and the application of this right of self-defense intelligible, at least to the degree of which it lends itself into a theoretical exposition. Now, I think that what he's, assuming here is that we have some knowledge about ancient Roman culture and Roman law, and also like from in a philosophical sense, Roman subjectivity and the entire within ancient Roman culture. If you're reading it, sources, the idea of individuality is not this modern sense of individualism, and in fact, doing something only for oneself is considered bad acting. And that translates especially into an aversion towards tyranny in really old Roman thought. Now, and then it of course comes back around with the declaration of Augustus, right? So there are different sorts of layers within Roman history and Roman law that is too much to go into here. But the idea of a supreme emperor type of thing, then that's different from the early Roman context that is being covered in, a thinker like Livy, who comes up here as well. So Livy Machiavelli, particularly on the idea of force. There's a lot hovering around here. But the reason why I mention this is because I think that from a United States perspective is that Americans might read this and they might think like, yeah, well, isn't this kind of like the militia that the US government and the Constitution allows for? And isn't this about Second Amendment rights? So that like the reason why we have the right to have guns is because like that if you're in a situation where the sovereign is really the people instead of a sovereign, then the people must be able to defend themselves, and they must be able to have that moment of recognition where it wouldn't even be insurrection, although some people might call it that, but it would be a preservation of the state. And I think that we see that um, in this kind of convoluted language around January 6th, right? From some people's perspective, they think that what they are doing is preserving the state, especially preserving an originary notion of the United States and that kind of constitutionalist original kind of stance. But from another position, it's an insurrection, it's an offense of against the state, and it is an attempt to break down law. And so we get this dialectical process in the United States now where the Democrats and the Republicans keep ratcheting up a more and more tighter hold on the idea of law and order politics that leads us towards dictatorship, that leads us towards totalitarian situations where people's individual freedoms and civil freedoms are being handed over to governance, and that is leading to our into our constitutional potential constitutional crisis, potential, as some people want to say, civil war type. I will leave that up to you. Some people are say that we're already in it. There are different perspectives out there. It's beyond my scope in this particular lecture series. Um, uh, on page 45, Agamben says, in his description of this Notstand in which any and every citizen seems to be invested with an imperium that is floating outside the law, Mommsen, one of the theorists, came as close as he could to formulating a theory of the state of exception, but he remained on this side of it. Again, Agamben is not a U.S. citizen, but I think that within American culture, and our attention to guns and all of that sort of stuff, this stuff has a lot of richness and meaning that um, uh, I can't unpack. I've already gone on for a really long time in this lecture, um, uh, but it's worth thinking about. So he goes on with his coverage of Eustidium as a concept in the earlier Roman law contexts. And it does have this resonance. Like if you're thinking about like the founders, like of the so-called founding fathers of the United States, like they're all really, really interested in Rome and Roman law. Rome definitely more than Greek. And so I think that it would be, a worthwhile project to take this kind of thinking and then go back and look at the Federalist Papers, or go back to look at the Anti-Federalist Papers, which might be like you might find a little bit more there. But that tension between Jeffersonian democracy, or the Jeffersonian Democrats, and the Federalists that come is part of the early six or so presidents before Jackson comes into to power, and the idea of the Jacksonian democracy versus the Whigs. And then later on, the arrival of the Republican Party with Lincoln and so far the Civil War and all that. Um, he ultimately is developing a critique of Schmidt here that arrives with uh, the concept of Eustidium. He says on page 47 in section 3.4, the confusion of the state of exception and dictatorship is the limitation that prevented both Schmidt in 1921 and Rossiter and Friedrich after World War II from resolving the aporias of the state of exception. In both cases, the error was self-serving, right? Like it's self-serving for Schmidt because he's he wants what eventually like becomes Nazism. In both cases, the error was self-serving since it's certainly easier to justify the state of exception juridically by inscribing it in the prestigious tradition of Roman dictatorship than by restoring it to its authentic but more obscure genealogical paradigm of Roman law, the Justitium. From this perspective, the state of exception is not defined as a fullness of powers, a plurimatic state of law as in the dictatorial model, but as a kenomatic state, an emptiness and standstill of the law. Like kenomatic meaning like the study of the movement of things without the force of the movement of things. Even in the philosophical tradition, this would be something like on the nature of things. Um, which I'm teaching right now, versus the kind of Platonic and Aristotelian, the Epicurean sort of tradition versus the Platonic and Aristotle division of things. Or I've been really, teaching Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle lately, and thinking about like the ways that Epicureanism develops and virtue ethics develops this idea of balance and medium. And so by the time we get to Lucretius and not on the nature of things, which is like our most hmm, um, developed model for what Epicureanism is, because we don't have much of Epicurus or Democritus earlier on. But we have Lucretius, but Epicurus says that like the poetry can't say anything. And so we want to be attentive to the fact that Lucretius has written a poem. So there's an aesthetic argument that Lucretius is making with his idea of the Klineman or the flow of atoms in atomic theory. That is not, of course, the modern notion of the atom, but that's unfolding with atomic science and with nuclear, or sorry, with particle physics and things like that. I think that there's a richness in that philosophy, and I would point you towards Thomas Nail's work at University of Denver here in town, here who's been doing a lot of work on Lucretius, but also Stephen Greenblatt's book on the rediscovery in the Renaissance of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things there. There's a different kind of thing. We're thinking about motion because like and the reason why that's a contrast with Aristotle is that Aristotle has this kind of prime mover type of idea in his philosophy. And then we could go back to the earlier Greeks and stuff as well, but I'm not going to do that right now. In the note here, what Agamben points out is that, and we do this in language all the time in the United States. We just go, oh, the dictator, and Hitler was a dictator, and Mussolini was a dictator, and like Agamben is clear here. He says neither Hitler nor Mussolini can technically be defined as dictators. Mussolini was the head of the government, legally invested with the office by the king, just as Hitler was chancellor of the Reich, named by a legitimate president of the Reich, Hindenburg. And as is well known, what characterizes both the fascist and Nazi regimes is that they allowed for the existing constitutions, um, the Albertine Statute and the Weimar Constitution, respectively, to subsist. And according to the paradigm that has been acutely defined as a dual state, they placed beside the legal constitution a second structure, more often not legally formalized, that could exist alongside the other because of the state of exception. From a juridical standpoint, the term dictatorship is entirely unsuitable for describing such regimes, just as, moreover, the clean opposition of democracy and dictatorship is misleading for any analysis of the governmental paradigms dominant today. And I think that this is what the Frankfurt School theorists would definitely say is like, yeah, like democracy, like the problem with liberal democracy is that it's never actually an opposite to totalitarian order. There's always this kind of tendency towards a totalitarian state within that. And that's what's happening in Marcuse, especially in repressive tolerance in the 1960s, later Marcuse kind of stuff. So then we get over to a conversation of public space in general. That the Eustidium seems to call into question the very consistency of public space, yet conversely, the consistency of the private space is also immediately neutralized to the same degree. In truth, this paradoxical coincidence of private and public, the US Kiwile and the Imperium, and in the extreme case, the juridical and non-juridical betrays the difficulty or impossibility of thinking of the essential problem, that the nature of the acts committed during the nature of the acts committed during the Eustidium. And then he maneuvers into this discussion of like, well, what happens in the state of exception if somebody does this horrible acts, like the camps, like this is what he's thinking of, the not the concentration camps, or outright murder of people. If it's happening during a state of exception, does it fall under legal recourse afterwards, right? This is exactly what the Nuremberg trials and the development of the Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide are dealing with in the 20th century. Is like how can we prosecute things that might have happened in a state of war or a state of exception? Is there a legal way to even think about this kind of stuff? And this leads us into um, uh, uh, a kind of summary at the end of this chapter here. He says, from a legal standpoint, it's possible to classify human actions as legislative, executive, or transgressive acts, but it is entirely clear that the magistrate or the private citizen who acts in a daring Eustidium neither executes nor transgresses the law, and even less so does he create the law. All of these questions about like, should we prosecute dictators, Milosevic being a more recent example. This is what's kind of behind the circumstances here, and also the idea of international law, which a lot of my American students just don't even have a sense of like that. And that there seems to be a retraction from agreements like NATO under Donald Trump recently, but also, what power does an entity like the United Nations have when you have different nations there calling out what they see as genocide in the Israel-Palestine situation, for example. The practical realm of where all this dense philosophy is showing up. So in his summary here in 3.6, this is the richness of um, Agamben's book. He says, one, the state of exception is not a dictatorship, but a space devoid of law, a zone of anomy, a law crossed out, right? Uh, in which all legal determinations, above all, the very distinction between public and private, are deactivated. Thus, all those trajectories are that seek to annex the state of exception immediately to the law are false. And so too are the theory and the necessity and as the originary source of law, the theory that sees the state of exception as the exercise of the state's right to defend itself, or as the restoration of the originary plurimatic state of law, or full powers of dictatorship in the way that we think about it normally. But fallacious, too, are the theories like Schmidt's that seek to inscribe the state of exception indirectly with the juridical context by grounding it in the division between norms and law, and norms and the realization of law, between constituent and constituted powers, between norm and decision. The state of necessity is not a state of law, but a space without law, even though it is not a state of nature. He wants to distinguish that, but presents itself as an anomy that results from the suspension of law. Thesis one. Thesis two. The space devoid of law seems for some reason to be so essential to the juridical order that it must seek in every way to assure itself of a relation to it. And as if in order to ground itself in um, uh, the juridical order necessarily had to maintain itself in relationship with an anomy. On the one hand, the juridical void at issue is that in the state of exception seems absolutely unthinkable for the law. On the other, the unthinkable thing nevertheless has a decisive strategy or a decisive strategic relevance for the juridical order and must not be allowed to slip away at any cost. The crucial problem, thesis three, is connected to the suspension of the law. The crucial problem is that the acts committed during the Eustidium the nature of which seems to be to escape all legal definition. Because they are neither transgressive, executive, or nor legislative, they seem to be situated in an absolute non-place with respect to the law. Thesis number 4. The idea of the force of law crossed out is a response to the undefinability of this non-place. It's as if the suspension of law freed a force of or a mystical element, a sort of legal mana, which is a totally mixed up term that Euro-Christians take from Maori culture. I said I would return to these terms later on in the text, right? When I was talking about Levi Strauss earlier, a sort of legal mana, the expression which is used by Wagenknecht to describe Roman auctoritas. So it's weird. That is both the ruling of power of its adversaries, the constituted power, as well as the constituent power that seek to appropriate. Force of law is separate from the law, floating the floating imperium being in force without application, and more generally, the idea of a zero degree of law, all of these fictions through which the law attempts to encompass its own absence and appropriate the state of exception, or at least to assure it with its own relationship to it. Though these categories, just like the concepts of mana or soccer, the sacred, separate, in anthropology and religious studies of the 19th century um, are really scientific mythologies. He knows that these are fictions and there's problem with the language. But Agamben says, nevertheless, this does not mean that it is impossible or useless to analyze the function they perform in the law's long battle over anomy. Indeed, it's possible that what is at issue in these categories is nothing less than the definition of what Schmidt calls the political. But I was already hinting that, like, Agamben's coming back to the idea of political. There's something Aristotelian about my reading of Agamben here. The essential task of a theory of the state of exception is not simply to clarify whether it has a juridical nature or not, but to define the meaning, place, and modes of its relationship to law. That ends chapter 3. And I've said a lot of external things, so I'm just going to end our conversation here today, or my contextualization, not much of a conversation right now, and pick up again with the end of his book in the final lecture for the critical theory class. Thank you for your eyes and ears and your thoughts. Have a great day whenever, wherever you are.